Today I decided to make a little truck talk Sunday video, and I wanted to basically give a general overall review of my time owning and taking care, being the caretaker of this 85 Isuzu pickup, 85 4x4 pup truck, because I know that I left out a lot of interesting details and facts about this truck through my short videos in the past that I've made. I think I've only made like 63 videos, something like that. I don't even know. But I've owned, first of all, I'd like to start off by saying I have owned myself since 2000, well, no, I shouldn't say that. Going back to 1994, actually, 1992. I first bought a 1981 Isuzu iMark two-door coupe with the 1.8 liter 4FB1 diesel engine in it. And at that time, it wasn't that old. You know, it was only like 10 years old. It only had like 89,000 miles on it. Bought it from a dealership locally. And it was in really good condition. Engine was clean. It had great compression, everything, just like a new one. And that thing could pull itself and 4 passengers up a mountain pass and pull away, giving it gas. It would pull away going up the hill, up the mountain pass. It had so much compression. 440 to 1 compression is what those 4FB1 diesels have. And when you're getting up into the higher elevations in the country, like 6,000 feet plus, it gets better gas mileage than the manufacturer specified miles per gallon in the specs. The specs call for the iMark 1.8 diesel to get around 40 to 41 miles per gallon. I was getting 50 to 51 miles per gallon in that little diesel at the higher elevations. 50 miles per gallon plus. And you think about that, this is in 1981 to 1992. These things were on the road. Today's vehicles, you're lucky to get 31 to 35 miles per gallon on the highway. And that was mechanically injected, not, so not electronic fuel injected. Big difference. They're just great engines. They're just great little cars. They're lightweight. They've got a high compression little diesel motor. It gets excellent fuel economy, and you just couldn't beat them, man. I love that car. And then after that, I had to get rid of it, and it was gone. And I actually rebuilt that engine. I'll tell you a little story about that car. The reason I got rid of it was because I was on the highway and the timing belt broke. Had a rubber timing belt, and I went into the dealer to have the timing belt checked before I took off on the trip. And I didn't have the money to pay the mechanic to put a new timing belt on. So I went on the trip anyway. Just had to go, Had the kids, family with me, and the timing belt broke on the highway in the middle of nowhere. And the nearest dealership shop that could do repairs was about 150 miles, 200 miles away. And all there was a motel. Stuck at a small town motel gas station. You know, there was nothing. And so ended up taking the bus. About a week later, realized that it was going to cost too much to repair it, and I was in no position to do the repairs myself. Didn't have a shop, tools, or anything. Barely had any money. So ended up taking a bus back home, and I just decided to ditch it, to leave the car there at the dealership. You know, there was nothing I could do. Couldn't afford to tow it back or anything. Couldn't go get it. So I just kind of left it. I abandoned it, you know. And funny thing is, about 2 years later, 2.5 years later, the dealership contacts me. I get a letter in my mailbox from the dealership. They had my address. I left them my address. And the letter said, we were wondering if you are still you still are interested in your vehicle. It's here if you want to come and pick it up. And that really threw me off, you know, because I abandoned the vehicle, and the dealership, which was a Chevrolet dealership, because Isuzu was partners with Chevrolet. They did all the mechanical work on those cars during that decade. So I was really surprised to hear that they still had the car there after 2.5 years later, and I never contacted them in that 2.5 years. So I went up and got the car. I was able to get it, and a friend of mine helped me out, a family member, go get it. And I get to the dealership, and this is like 500 to 600 miles away from my home. And there's the car sitting there in the dealership storage, secured storage lot, gated, cyclone fenced off area. And it wasn't that big of a storage area, but it was a huge cyclone fence, you know, like 8 feet tall, and a small lot, maybe 5,000, 10,000 square foot section of ground out in the middle of nowhere. And there's my car sitting there pretty much all by itself, the only car in there. Same condition as the way I left it. It was just a little dusty, had a lot of dust on it. Not a scratch, no damage. It was completely protected and secured in a security facility at the dealership for over 2.5 years. I asked them, how much do I owe you for holding it for me? And they said, no charge. No charge. They didn't want any money from me. After they stored it on their property, in their possession, their care, for over 2 years, without any word from me. All I had was my address that I left with them. Now, do you think that would happen today in these times? A dealership, think they would keep the vehicle, hold on to it, and then contact you 2.5 years later asking you if you still want the vehicle, you can come and get it. There's no charge. You know, I mean, you talk about excellent customer service. I've never experienced customer service like that from any company. Any company. This was a Chevrolet dealership. So enough. I'm done with that story. The rest of the story I'm gonna proceed with is I've owned 4 Isuzu pup pickup trucks in the last 15 or so years, since 2006. Well, I guess it's been about 18 years. And almost 20 years. I've had 4 Isuzu pup pickups ranging from 82, 83, 84, and 85. Those are the exact years of each pickup truck. Each truck was a different year. 82, 83, 84, 85. The 1984 was a diesel pickup truck, and it was all rusted out. Frame was totally rusted out. I mean, it was gone. It was trash, non-repairable. But the interior was immaculate. The interior was like new condition. It was phenomenal. The condition of the interior. Just the frame was rotten. The engine, still perfectly running good engine, cranked as soon as you turn the key to start. It was on and running. When that key hit the start position, it was on and running. As soon as that engine started turning over, the split fraction of a second it started turning, it was on and running. 1984 diesel, 2.2 liter pup, long bed, rusted out frame. Probably had about 200,000 miles on it, 185 something. So I had 4 of those. The other 2 was gas. One had a G200 engine in it like this one, my 1985. The other one was a short bed, and it had the 1.8, which the G180, which is I think the same engine that was in the Chevy Loves from 78, 79, somewhere in there. And that engine was bulletproof. The G180 Chevy Love pickup truck engine, bulletproof. I used to be a ranch operator and a caretaker of a major ranch in the United States, in Montana, and this was in the 80s. And one of the ranch vehicles was a 78, 79 Chevy Love, and it had the 1.8 G180 motor in it, and it looked like a crushed beer can. And it was dirtier and dustier because it had never been cleaned. Nobody ever cleaned it for like 20 years. And we used it for everything, from hauling gear, hay, feed, for livestock animals. It was a cattle ranch, horse and cattle ranch, livestock ranch. And people they just beat on it. Anyone who drove it, we all beat on it, and we were driving it over irrigation ditches across the fields. And just tearing it up. And that thing was a tank. Now I think the owner rebuilt the engine and had it rebuilt once, but the years that I drove it, it was a filthy, dirty animal, but it ran perfect. So yeah, I had 4 Isuzu pup pickup trucks, 82, 83, 84, 85. And I also had 2 iMark sedan diesels, and I had 2 iMark 2-door coupes, like the LS coupe. So I've had 4 iMark diesels, and I've had 4 Isuzu Pup pickup trucks. I've rebuilt 3 of the diesel engines, all 4FB1 diesel engines, successfully. And I've rebuilt Isuzu Pup, and I've rebuilt 360 V8 made by General Motors for the Jeep, the big Jeep Grand Wagoneer. So I have a lot of experience rebuilding engines, and some technical ability. So I've had 8 Isuzu pickups and cars, both diesel and gas, from the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, in the last 18 years. I have some experience with these Isuzus, and I know their temperament, and I know their temperamental vehicles. So I've learned how to take care of them. I've learned what can go wrong with them most often, less often, where the weak points are, where the strong points are. For the most part, in general, they're really reliable vehicles, as long as you take care of them, as long as you change the oil, keep the engine oil clean. Oil and filter, you run the right viscosity of oil, the right thickness. You don't want too thick of an oil, because that'll plug up the oil jets in the crankshaft that lubricates the bearings, and it'll also plug up the lubricating jet that oils the timing chain in the front, behind the front cover, because it's just a little tiny oil jet. I mean, that's really, really small oil jet that keeps that chain lubricated. Generally they're pretty good. Now this truck, starting from the beginning, I bought this truck for $500 from an old guy, and he decided there was a lot of people calling on it. He said that I was the only one that was willing to give him $500 for the truck. That's why he called me back, because he said in his ad that he wouldn't take less than $500. He was firm on that price, and I was the only one who told him that I'll pay you the $500, what you want for it. I'm not going to try to talk you down, or kick your tires and BS you, because that is a lot of BS. People trying to talk people down when they're already in the dollars and pennies, in their offer. So, and he didn't want to part with the truck, so I was lucky to get it. And he said he didn't know what was wrong with it, but he loved the truck. And I could tell that somebody replaced the head gasket on it, and it blew out again. It might have blew out after he bought it, but it looked like a fresh head gasket change out to me. And I think he was just over revving the engine and running the revs too high, because he was hauling like concrete blocks and stuff up a steep mountain hill. And so that's why I think the head gasket blew, is it was a hot day, and hauling a ton of bricks, going up a steep mountain hill on a steep grade, steep incline, and he was just over revving it, and it just, it just popped, man. The head gasket popped. These weren't designed to over rev for long periods of time. They're pretty much designed for 55 miles per hour on the highway during the 80s when the speed limit was 55 miles per hour on the highway. Now, my experience rebuilding the motor. I didn't know what was wrong with it until when I started it up and ran it. It did start and run right away, but it was hissing and spitting and ticking really loud. So that pretty much told me that it was the head gasket, and I pretty much knew what direction to go in at that point. Do a compression check first thing. Compression check was the tattletale. Told me that only 2 cylinders were firing. The number 3 and 4 were losing compression severely, almost 5 pounds, down to 5 pounds on both cylinders. But it was still running. It was still running. It was acting like it was running on 3 cylinders. The gasket blew between the number 3 and the number 4 right there on the wall. So compression was kind of going back and forth from the 3rd to the 4th, and it was misfiring. And but it was still running, and it was overheating. Didn't take long for it to overheat, the needle to go up into the red zone, the high mark section of the gauge. So I knew what to do, but like me, like I've always been, I just got to rebuild the motor. It's just what I do. It's an automatic reaction to a crisis, and that's what I've always done. And so, so I ended up pulling the head off 3 times and putting it back on 3 times with 3 new head gaskets. And every time I did it and I torqued those bolts down to the specifications in the factory manual, any manual that covers this vehicle, which is 72 pounds, every time I torqued it down to those specs, the gasket, it just wouldn't hold the pressure in the cylinders, and gases would escape, leak into the coolant system chambers, channels, and it would go into the red. And the first time I replaced the gasket and reassembled it and then started it, I thought, well, I didn't really know exactly what it was. If it was the gasket, if it was a crack in the head. But I had the cylinder head cleaned and checked for cracks at a machine shop. So my gut told me it wasn't a crack in the head, because I trusted the machine shop to do its job, and they did. My second instincts told me that it was a crack in the block around the coolant, somewhere around the coolant passage in the cylinder wall, maybe a capitulated cylinder wall. It's got pitting in it, rust pitting, and it went all the way through the wall into the coolant section of the block, where gases just went right through the block into the coolant holding area, which I was hoping that wasn't the case, because finding another block is highly risky. You know, good luck finding another block, the same block, and it's going to cost you. You pretty much have to just buy another engine. But my gut told me that it wasn't a cracked block. Now, when I took the head off the first time, I noticed there was a stain, a yellow stain down the side of the engine block where the head gasket had previously blown out, and coolant, hot steam, water had leaked down the side of the block and stained it. So I could see there was a blown head gasket in the past with that stain. And I was telling myself, well, I hope it didn't get hot enough, they didn't run it out of water and crack the block. But my gut feeling told me that it didn't, because like I said, I've had 8 Isuzu cars and trucks, four pups, 3 of them gas, and the rest, you know, the other ones gas and diesel I-marks, and they've never had a cracked block. They've never even had a cracked cylinder head. These engines they're pretty much bulletproof engines. As the only thing that's probably most likely going to happen is you're going to blow the head gasket. Even if you have a hose water leak on the highway and you run it and you're out of water and it's steaming, I mean, you're not going to crack the block. You may crack the head, but cracking the block, the cast iron block, is very difficult to do. But anyway, so my gut told me that it was just the head gasket, and after replacing the head the first time and it didn't work, I decided to pull the engine out completely, because I think I replaced the head first and I left the engine in, and then the engine overheated when I went to restart it, and I didn't know what it was. So then I decided, okay, I'm just going to pull the whole engine out and rebuild it, go through it, have the block check for cracks, everything. So I take the block to a small shop locally, and this is a shop that's been around for like 50, 60 years in this area. Small little tiny dump shop. And I kind of told myself, I don't think I should really take my engine here to have these guys work on it, because there's better shops in the area, more modernized shops with computerized equipment and everything, and the techs to go with it, and managers to supervise the operation. And I know where these shops are at. I've used them before. And I won't take my engines to anywhere else now. From now on, I'll just go to a professional shop. And so I pulled the engine out. They cleaned the block eventually and checked it for cracks. No cracks. And now when I pulled the block out and I pulled it apart, I ended up, when I took the cover, the aluminum timing cover off, I ended up breaking the bolt around the water pump water channel, and the bolt broke because it was rusted. It was rusted out. Now this wasn't the engine. This was actually used a different. I bought another engine, like I said before, from Georgia or some other place, some other wrecking yard somewhere, and I took that one apart, but I pulled this one out of the vehicle because I wanted to put the one from the wrecking yard in this one and just keep the original out for a nice rebuild later on, which I still plan on doing. So I broke the bolt, and it broke off flush below the front of the engine plane, the flat plane of the block in the front of the engine. I had to extract it, and it was rusted. It was rusted, locked in there, and it was a bitch. And I gave it all I had, and I ended up drilling it out with a drill bit, a slightly smaller drill bit than the threads, and you know how it comes out pretty easy that way. And then I ended up re-drilling out the hole and putting a time cert insert in the hole, which is the best method for doing that, because you're able to use the same original bolt that way when you use a time cert replacement threaded kit. They're not cheap, but that's the best method to use. Healy coils are kind of they work, but they're kind of half-ass, and the time certs are really the best, in my own opinion. So I did that. It came out clean. It was beautiful, and that worked fine. But I had to weld the crack up. When I broke the bolt off, I ended up putting too much stress and hammering on it with my vice grips and my hammer to try to undo the bolt. I put a big crack because the wall around the outside of the block, around that water chamber that the water pump connects to, that wall is very thin. It's less than a 1/4 inch, and so I put a big crack about an inch and a 1/4 long on the outside of the block, right outside the water channel, which is the last place you want a crack to happen at, the worst place. And so I had to weld it. And I do have some experience in welding. I have 30 years professional welding experience, heavy duty industrial welding, and but I did it on the cheap. See, because after I left the welding industry, the welding trade, I just never was interested in welding again, and so I never really wanted much to do with welding equipment and stuff ever again. Because after 30 years of doing something, you're trying to get away from it, get out of that field. And so I never bought a welding machine, a professional welder for the home or anything. Most guys do. They buy welders for their houses, and because they just love it and stuff. So I just bought a cheap $100 welder, inverter welder, off Amazon, and I bought a generator, that had a 240 outlet on it, and it had a 30 amp and 50 amp outlet on it, which I could run this welder on and get the juice I needed to burn up to 332 rod successfully. So I bought that $100 cheap welder off Amazon, and then I bought some stick. Welding stick from a company called Muggy Weld USA or something like that, and they make different types of rods, specialized rod for cast iron, for more for welding up cracks in engine blocks and welding cast iron. They make this rod, two types of rod actually. They make a dirty rod for dirty cast iron, then they make the finishing cover pass rod for over the top to finish it out. It's expensive, but it worked pretty good. It worked really good with this welder. And so I was successful with welding up the crack in the block, and I never did that before. I never welded a crack in an engine block before, so it's something that you want to get right the first time. And of course I had to heat the cast up, warm it up before I welded on it, and I could only weld a little bit at a time, like a 1/2 inch section at a time. Let it cool slightly, because that cast gets hot really fast if you do continuous welding, and you don't want to get it too hot too fast, because it'll crack when it starts to cool. So you have to keep it warm, you have to preheat it. You can only do a little 1/2 inch at a time, and you have to let it cool down a little bit before you can continue and add another 1/2 inch pass. And that's what I did through the whole inch and 1/4. And fortunately for me, it worked successfully, and it was a good weld. And my only other option, I took it to get an estimate from a welding shop nearby, and the guy said he wouldn't even touch it. He wouldn't touch it because he wanted to do it his way and use some specialized welding procedure, fusion type welding procedure, with some sort of special flux powder, and fuse it, heat it up to 2000 degrees, and make some special fusion weld. And he said he wouldn't even touch it. And this guy looked pretty experienced. I mean, he sounded like he acted like he was a pro, but I mean, I've got some experience myself in welding, and I'm not afraid to do anything, so I was skeptical anyway about going to this private little welding shop, and this guy turned me down. He said he didn't want to do it. It was too risky for him. So I just took it home and did it myself with a cheap little $100 inverter welder and some Muggy Weld welding rod and a little propane torch head, just to warm up the cast iron and keep it warm while it was cooling. Slow cool it. It was so simple that anybody could do it. Anybody can do it, and you don't need to take it to a shop and pay $2,000 or whatever to have them weld up a 1-inch crack. Just practice a little bit in a cast iron skillet pan. Get yourself an old cast iron skillet pan that you used to make pancakes. Those are about a 1/4 inch thick, and you can make a little groove, make a little cut in it, and weld it. Practice your welding just like you're welding on the engine block. And that's what I did. I just practiced on a cast iron skillet. You just take your time. You don't rush anything. Don't feel like you have to hurry up and get this done, because it only takes a couple hours in your garage. Just takes a couple hours of time. That's it. And so anyway, back to the engine. First time I pulled the head off, left the engine in, replaced the gasket, put it back on, it overheated again. It was still overheating. I didn't know what it was. Wasn't sure if it was a crack, gasket, or whatnot. So then at that point I decided to take the engine out and take the other engine apart, have it all checked out for cracks, put it back in, put the head back on with a second head gasket. And after I did that, torqued those bolts down to spec again, it still overheated. So then at that point I knew that it was the head gasket. The head gasket most likely wasn't sealing, but I wasn't sure. I thought maybe it's something else still. Maybe it's not the head gasket, because how could it be the head gasket, right? You ask yourself, how could it be the head gasket? It's a brand new head gasket. You're torquing the bolts down to 72 pounds, which is what the book says to, and every time you do it, it overheats. It can't. So nothing was making sense, but a gut feeling told me that something clicked with me, and it was this point that I already knew from past experience, that bolts stretch out when they're tightened down to heavy torque specifications. They stretch. And that clicked in my brain from past experience, memory. And I said, well, yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe the bolts they keep stretching every time I torque them down, and 72 foot-pounds of torque isn't enough. So at that point, I had a decision to make. First decision was either replace the bolts, which I can't buy new ones, they don't make them anymore, can't get them anywhere. Option number 2, buy threaded studs and use Loctite and put nuts and washers on the threaded studs. Option 3, reuse the bolts again, and if it does it again, retighten the bolts down, but add another 10 to 12 pounds of torque on top of the 72 foot-pounds, making it about 84 foot-pounds, or 85 foot-pounds, and then see what the temperature gauge reads after you start running the engine. And after I did that, the temperature went down on the gauge to about midway, the halfway mark between cold and hot. And then I knew, then and there, that was the issue all the time. And it was a lot of work, it was a lot of work to come to that conclusion for me, because I never had that happen to me before, where I've reused head bolts on the diesel engine, on the 1.8 Isuzu diesel in the iMarks, and torqued them down to spec, and I never had any issue. No issues at all with the diesels. But it's just this gas engine, the 1.9, that's giving me the trouble. I don't know about the 1.8. I've never rebuilt the 1.8. I've only had the issue on this G200 engine. And a lot of people, I notice I haven't really got very many likes at all on my earlier video on retorquing head bolts and torque solutions, reusing the head bolts and torque solutions. It's like, so I'm kind of getting the feeling that people just, they're not into reusing head bolts. And that's okay. That everybody can do whatever they want to do. For me, I didn't have an option, had no option available to me in the matter. So that's what I did. I just reused them. And what I've realized, I came to the conclusion that you can tighten those head bolts down more, a little bit more, and they will tighten down. But you just have to remember to use like ARP assembly grease. That's the ARP grease, not the assembly lube, like the blue gel for lubricating bearings, but the ARP grease, assembly grease. It's like a gray grease. It was gray when I used it. I think it was gray or purplish red, or yeah, it was red. It was like a red grease, and now it's black or something. It might be grayish black now, but it's like a grease, and it sticks like a grease, like wheel bearing grease. It sticks. And you want to use that stuff under the head bolt heads, the seating part under the bolt of the bolt on top of the head bolt. You lubricate that area that sits down on the cylinder head and the washer too, so that bolt spins freely on that grease and that washer. You don't want to use oil, because one thing that I've learned through experience is that oil runs off. It runs off like water, leaving nothing left but a thin film. And then when you in the old days, they used to dip the head bolts in like a can of oil, and then they drop it down in the hole, the cylinder head hole, and screw them in. Well, when they did that, they weren't thinking that the oil would leak and run off the bolt all over the head gasket down in the hole, and the cylinder head's not even making contact yet. There's still a gap on top and below of the gasket, so the oil seeped in over the gasket under the cylinder face of the head where the water channels are at. And you also contaminated the head gasket sealing, the sealing portion side of the head gasket when that oil seeps in. So they were pretty much defeating the whole purpose of the operation. And maybe that's why head gaskets were always popping back then too. You never know, but that's my thought. So I just use the ARP sticky grease. It doesn't run, it doesn't leak under the face of the head or the block. It doesn't contaminate the sealing portion of the gasket. It just stays on the bolt. That's it. It stays on the threads. It stays on the bottom part of the bolt head that sits and spins over the head, pushing the head down. And with that grease, since it stays there and it has very high lubrication ability, you can retighten those head bolts down a second time without re-loosening them. So you can add another 10-12 pounds of torque. Now me, I was able to turn the bolts 3 times, but on the third time it was very tight, and a couple of them didn't want to turn anymore, so I just left them there. I left them alone, and I turned what could turn, and I left the other ones tight that didn't want to turn, and that worked out